Now, workshop one, the subject on which they were asked to debate and to discuss and to come to recommendations was as follows. Orangutan conservation, rehabilitation as an effective conservation strategy. The spokesman for this group is Roger Wilson, who is actually a senior staff member of the World Land Trust, but he speaks for the group, and his association with the World Land Trust is irrelevant under these circumstances. Roger, please. Do you wish to come up here?
Do I? Okay. I must first admit to being in a strange position here as someone who's never even been to Southeast Asia and who was co-opted by his group to speak for them. So, I must also admit that I started off basically negative to what we were saying, to the point we were discussing, which was rehabilitation as an effective conservation strategy. I did not see the connection, and my ideas were shaken. So, in speaking for the group, I'm also speaking for partial conversion. Basically, our group believed that rehabilitation has definite elements within it which contribute to an effective conservation strategy. I will stress right now there are many issues around this which are knocking backwards and forwards, cost, relative cost, etc. But it does contribute to an effective conservation strategy. We saw it basically as, in terms of the real situation on the ground, being something of a continuum. In fact, the real situation was that there is a position where orangutans are being handed over to people to look after. There is nothing else to do with them. That is the situation. It is there. What do you do with these animals when they come in? And this is a welfare situation, essentially. You have animals to look after. They're also endangered animals, so already there is a conservation mark on there, but it is a welfare issue right there. However, in dealing with this situation, they're on your hands, then the follow-through to that must continue to a conservation end, because if you do not deal with the conservation end, then you will always be having these animals on your hands until there are no more. So essentially, it is not so black and white as it appears. If you're just looking at it, conservation, rehabilitation, conservation welfare, etc. You have to look across the continuum. The way that we saw it then was, come what may, you must start from that point, and there is a line to follow. The animals have to be looked after. The aim must be then to move along towards managing or introducing them to the point, or bringing them on to the point where they can be an effective semi-wild population at least. And again, this is a practical situation that the animals are there. They must be taken from the centres into semi-wild conditions, because that, again, is the practical issue. But at this point, conservation points start to kick in. If one has semi-wild populations, then these can be used for your main education, social support, political support, funding. You're basically stocking animals, remember, still, whether they were in the center to begin with, and now they're in the semi-wild population, you're still stocking them, but now they are levering the support for conservation at all levels. They also represent at least a good part of the genetic bank, if you like, of the populations as a whole. So you can't ignore them in that sense. This process must continue, or should be made to continue, to the end point of rehabilitation, which would be that these animals return to the wild. If not these animals themselves, if as a semi-wild population they had reproduced, then those reproduced animals would go to the wild. That would be the continuum, preferably also not where they would mix again with pre-existing viable populations, but there seems to be space where they could go, where they would be able to go into the wild without that issue. So this is the way that we saw it. But that was conditional on if you want to have the conservation end, rather than simply the welfare end of looking after individual animals which are on your hands, and you want to take it through into conservation, there has to be a certain number of things done. The first is, there seems to be, to me as an outsider, a strange gap in that there is no evidence, hard evidence yet, of survival and breeding in the wild. And this situation is something which has to be demonstrated. A necessary proportion as well of all those benefits that can be gained from having semi-wild populations that people can see, taking incidentally the pressure off wild ones for things like tourism and the like, must be a necessary proportion of the benefits, the funds, the political leverage, should be directed towards conservation of wild populations and their habitats. Without that, this process would jam at that point. Disease and behavioral problems was also something which came up, and we believe that these were things which had to be monitored but did not represent immediate barriers for this progression towards conservation, but nonetheless had to be borne in mind. And that essentially was our position at the end of the day. If one goes back, is reintroduction as important as conservation, as habitat protection? Maybe not as important, but it is not unimportant by any means. It is part of a spread of actions. Can it be an effective conservation strategy? It can be certainly part of a conservation strategy. Note the effectiveness needs to be checked. I personally, as someone looking at it from the outside, would say that even if one found that the individual animals did not go as far as becoming truly free living again, or that their offspring couldn't, I would still see that the leverage, the political leverage, the funding leverage of using these semi-wild, half-rehabilitated populations, if you like, in, for instance, patches of forest where they may be able to survive. If that funding is then reused for conservation of truly wild populations and good habitat for them, then that's part of a conservation strategy in itself. So one does see that line. That's where we stood. I've probably got my 10 minutes up.
You have? Very fine. Thank you very much indeed.